Welcome to General Science Module 16, Part 2. Last time we talked about the central and peripheral nervous systems. Now we're going to get to the third part, the sensory nervous systems, the nerves that goes from sensory organs in your body back to your brain. We're going to walk through different parts of it. So again, if you have your books, or you should have your book, have that handy and ready to open up. Actually, the first page we're going to go to is page 406. Okay, so we're going to talk about different types of senses. The first one has kind of a strange name. Whoops, let me get my pen. Gustatory sense. Your gustatory sense is your sense of taste. Based in your tongue. If you kind of feel your tongue right now, you can feel it's kind of rough. Those little bumps in there are called papillae. Papillae, some of them have small holes in them called taste pores, and inside of those taste pores are taste buds. Basically, tiny cells with hairs on them. They're sensitive to certain chemicals. So when certain chemicals are dissolved in your saliva, it goes into your taste pore, to your taste bud, and your sense of taste can find it. On page 406, you see a diagram of a tongue with your tongue, and then a smaller diagram of your taste buds, simplified support cells, sensory cells, and nerves. Interesting. They say that taste, originally they used to say taste was divided into 4 basic sensations. You could taste sweet. You could taste salty, you could taste sour, and you could taste bitter. Relatively recently, they've added a 5th taste called umami. Sweet, salt, salty, sour, bitter, you're familiar with. Umami is your savory sense. Basically, they say it is the taste of I'm trying to remember the name of that. Amino acids, building blocks for proteins. So it's what amino acids taste like. So sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. Interesting things about these. Sweet, generally the stronger the chemical, the sweeter it tastes, and the more pleasant it is, up to a point where people say it's too sweet. Salty and sour are unusual because they work really well when it's lightly salted, lightly sour. But as it becomes more and more salty and more sour, it becomes unpleasant. Bitter, especially, very light. Most people like very light bitter. And as we get more intense there, it becomes unpleasant. So believe that a lot of this sensations are for recognizing in the animal kingdom poisonous materials. Poisonous materials tend to be bitter, sour, things like that, so that the animals would stay away from them. Okay. Tied closely to your gustatory sense is your olfactory sense. Now, olfactory you've probably heard of before. Olfactory is smell. These two senses are tied very closely together. What's interesting about smell, let's see, they don't have a good diagram here, but inside your nasal cavity, at the top of your nasal cavity, is an area called your olfactory epithelium. Epithelium is another name for skin, so olfactory epithelium. In there are millions of cells that have little olfactory sense cells. Some of these are olfactory sense cells, and they have little hairs that go into the mucus in your nose. When things that we smell, the chemicals that are in the air, dissolve into the mucus, just similar to how your sense of taste works. Sense of smell reacts to those and gives you the different smells. Interesting thing about the olfactory versus the gustatory senses, they're tied together. So they're very similar in how they work anyway, but when you can only really taste 5 different things, and so combinations of 5 different things don't necessarily account for every taste. But when you add in smell, when you can smell it, that increases the variables, and you can taste a lot of different things. Interesting, if you ever got a bad cold and you're all stuffed up and you can't breathe very well, you'll notice that the food tastes kind of bland or not as good as you remember it. That's because it's tied to that smell. They mentioned an interesting thing in there about cats, how cats are extremely sensitive to smell, and thus they like the very smelly things like tuna and things like that to eat. Okay. Also mentioned how smells are tied to memory. A lot of people, when they smell things that trigger certain memories, that's because the sense of smell wanders through the limbic system in your brain. The limbic system is responsible for memories and emotions. Okay. Our next sense is the human sense of vision. We've covered this a little bit before already, but let's go into it. So on page 409, there is a simplified picture of the eye. In there you see he's looking at a little triangle, and the light passes through the cornea, which does a little refraction of the light, and through the pupil into the lens, which refracts light more and focuses on the retina on the back of the eye. That lens and that focus system work really well. What's kind of interesting is it's very different from like a camera. If you're familiar with a camera has a lens that moves back and forth. Now cameras are phones, and so it all does it for you automatically, but generally there's a mechanism that moves the lens back and forth to cause focus. With the eye, if you look at that picture, there are muscles around the eye called the ciliary muscle. When this muscle is relaxed, the lens is very thin, and thus we can easily focus on things that are far away. We don't need as much refraction to focus if they're far away. When the muscles tense, it causes the lens to bulge out more, and thus it allows us for focusing on closer objects because there's more refraction needed to get a focus with that. So kind of interesting, when your eyes relaxed, it's actually focused further away. Maybe that's why your eyes get tired when you read too much. Okay. On the opposite side of the ciliary, or the opposite side of the lens, is the retina. This is where all the magic happens, where that's focused. The retina has cells called rods and cells called cones. Rods see in black and white, or what's called definition. They give us definition. Without our rods, things would look a little more blurry. We'd see more blurry shapes, and we would see the blacks and the whites in there. Cones give us color. There are 3 different types of cones. There are red, there are blue, and there are green cones. And out of those 3 types of senses of light, we get all the colors that we can see. So what happens is light passes through the lens focused on the retina. This activates chemicals in the rods or the cones, which through a series of chemical reactions, cause an electric charge to be built up, which passes down the nerve cells into the optic nerve. As it travels down the optic nerve, ganglia, small groups of nerve cells, do some pre-processing of the image, and then it reaches the brain, where the image is actually processed. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is this happens in less than 1/1000th of a second. In less than 1/1000th of a second, it activates chemicals in your rods and cones and gets the information to your brain to be processed by your brain. Extremely fast. Now, in your eye, you have about 125 million rods and cones that process that information, and so that sends it down 125 million nerves, which some of the nerve ganglia, the nerve cells along the way, pre-process the information, and then that goes to your brain. and in less than 1,000th of a second, your brain processes the image and gives you an image in your mind that you can understand. They've done some work on this. They figure using today's supercomputers, they could do these same calculations with, if they set up enough sensors and things, that what it takes our eye to do in a second would take a supercomputer about 100 years to process. So your brain is extremely efficient and unusual at this. Kind of an interesting thing with your eye. So I said you got red, blue, and green cones. So because of that, it's not just these cones that cause your eye to see. Your brain does a job there as well. So what's kind of interesting about your brain, let me get a decent red here. Let's see. Okay. So what's cool about this is your brain does a lot of the work for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the screen here a big red dot. I'm going to click off somewhere. Okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to stare at that red dot and keep staring. You can blink. You don't have to dry your eyes out or anything, but keep staring. If you see there's a little center mark in the center, maybe keep staring at that center mark. And while I'm talking, what's happening is the rods in your eye that are set up for red are now seeing red. It takes a lot of energy for this to happen, and eventually your rods get tired. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look over here. So look at there. And notice, what color do you see? You should see kind of a blue-green circle about the size of the circle we were just looking at, unless, of course, you're colorblind. But what happens there is, in order for you to see white, your red, blue, and green cones all fire. So white is all three colors. If you take red light, green light, and blue light and put them together, you get white light. When you see red, all you're seeing is red. So you're looking at the red dot, and the red cones in your eye are getting tired. It takes a lot of energy, like I said, and eventually they start shutting down so that they can recover. But your brain's kind of cool. It says, oh, I know there's red there. The cones have stopped sending information, but I'm not getting any new information, so I know it's red. I'm going to keep it red. So your brain just says, that's red until I say otherwise. So it keeps saying red, red, red. Then when you look away, all of a sudden, the rods and cones in that area say, hey, something new. And so the blue and green say, hey, I see blue, I see green, which is part of white. The red are still tired, so they can't do anything. So they just sit there, and you see the blue-green instead of the white. So kind of an interesting little thing with that. At the back of your eye, go back to page 409, you see the optic nerve comes into the back of the eye. Now the optic nerve leaves through a small portion of the retina, and this creates what's called a blind spot in your sight. So in your eyes, there's a small area that you cannot see anything on. Now what's kind of interesting is you don't see two black spots, but just like your brain said there's red there, your body fills in that spot with the information around it. On page 411, there is an experiment with your blind spot. If you want to try that out, it's kind of cool. Gives you a chance to see how your brain handles the blind spot and fills it in with what's around it. So, okay. So now let's move to our next sense. This sense is a little different. This sense is the sense of touch. Here, I'm going to make myself some room on the whiteboard. Okay. So now we got the sense of touch. Sense of touch is a little different. Sense of touch is different because it is all over your skin. Whoops. Change my colors back. Oop, there we go. There. Okay. So sense of touch is your skin, all over your skin. It is there all the time. This is called a somatic sense. It's a little different than your eyes and ears and tongue. It doesn't come from a certain direction. It's not triggered by the same thing all the time. Your skin has millions upon millions of neurons that are attached to different kinds of receptors on your skin. Kind of interesting, So you're receiving this information all the time. Have you ever had your arm fall asleep? If your arm falls asleep, people often say, "Oh, you cut the blood off on your arm." Yeah. But really, you're not cutting off the blood flow because that would cause your arm to die or start dying. What you're doing is you're pinching the nerves that go to your arm. And so the nerves can't send information. So your body no longer receives information from your arm. It says it must not be there anymore. So your brain says, well, I guess that's gone. I'm just going to move on with my life and go forward. So then you move and you unpinch those nerves. All of a sudden your brain can start receiving information again. Now your arm has millions of nerve receptors. So all at once they're all saying, "Hey, I'm here. Look at me. I can feel stuff. I can sense this." And your brain senses all of that. So for a little while, it takes your brain to realize, "Hey, my arm's back. I'll just put it back on normal mode." What's kind of interesting about that is really what's happening throughout your entire body. Your brain senses all that all the time. So it's as if your entire body were asleep and you were getting tingles everywhere. But your brain filters out the information it doesn't need. Say, oh, nothing's changed there, I'm going to ignore that. Like right now, if you think about it, you can feel the inside of your socks and your feet. Most of the time you don't pay attention to that, but if you consciously go there, you can feel that. So those millions of nerves are sending information all the time. They talk a little bit, I think, later on, or maybe in this part, about a disease called leprosy. Leprosy is where those nerve endings get damaged or don't function anymore, and you can't feel. Interesting thing, you can't feel pain, anything like that, but that has its dangers that you can read about in there. But there is an actual disease. It's different than the leprosy of the Bible. Leprosy of the Bible might have included that, but more likely it was skin disease. This is leprosy of the Bible. Okay, so we talked about sight, taste, touch, so let's talk about hearing. In your book, turn to page 416. And here's a diagram of the ear. So hearing is caused by vibrations in the air. So compression waves traveling through the air. So you look on your diagram, you've got the ear on the outside, that funny looking piece of skin and cartilage on the outside of our heads. That is there to funnel sound into the ear canal. So when sound travels down the ear canal, it hits the eardrum, also known as the tympanic membrane. It's kind of like a drum across there, and it'll vibrate that eardrum. Attached to that eardrum are 3 bones. I guess they don't want you to know the names of the bones, they just call them the ear ossicles. These ossicles kind of amplify this vibration. The end of the ossicles attaches to what's called your cochlea. It looks kind of like a snail. Inside the cochlea is a fluid, a kind of a thicker fluid, a little bit thicker than water, but not like jelly. And it causes vibrations into that fluid. Inside that cochlea are little sensor hairs, like you had in your tongue, like you had in your sense of smell. And those sense vibrations. And based on the sound, different types of sound, it will travel further, less intensely through the different loops of the cochlea, and then that is transferred to the auditory nerves and up to your brain so that you can hear. Okay. Last thing they talk about is an old wives' tale from when I was young that says we only use 10% of our brain. This is an old wives' tale. They think it might be because there was a scientist back in the, I believe, early 1900s that did experiments with rats where he removed portions of their brain and see if they could still function. He found that he could remove about 90% of rats' brains and it would still function. Obviously, you couldn't talk to them, you couldn't find out exactly what's going on, and our brains are kind of interesting. It will tend to adapt if we have that kind of problem. The story of a guy who wasn't the smartest guy in the world, but he was able to take care of himself and got married, had kids, and when he died, he ended up donating his brain to science. And they opened up his skull and found that only half of his brain had developed. one of the lobes of his brain had not developed, but his other half had taken over and was able to compensate so that he wasn't super smart, but he wasn't stupid, and he could still function as a human. So kind of interesting. So 10% of our brain, that's a fallacy. We use 100% of our brain. If you take scans of your brain while you're thinking, things like that, you'll see all different parts of your brain light up all the time. Okay, so this ends Module 16 and the end of the book. Next week we'll have a slightly different video for you to watch. But again, if you have any questions, send them to Mr. C at mrcscience.com, and we'll see you next week.